So a big part about identifying plants is being able to identify them to species. That's basically what it means to identify a plant. And I think it's important to cover this topic where we can consider a little bit what it means to be a species, right? So how do you know when you've identified a plant, when you've put the right name on it and eliminated all other possible names for the plant? So it kind of comes down to a little bit of biology, what makes the plant a species, and a little bit about the classification system and the categories that we put plants into. So uh, I think maybe getting familiar with this will get you more confidence in being able to say that you've definitely identified a plant, or maybe even a little more confidence in having some uncertainty, right? So you can identify it and say, well, it's one of these two species. And that's sometimes a good enough identification and way better than not having any name at all. So here's an illustration of one of our plant species. So here's an example of a group. This is a genus, buttercup, genus Ranunculus, that has a lot of species in Wisconsin. And when you have a species, you've got a plant with a name on it, right? So you look at this plant and you say, that plant is one of these three species, let's say Ranunculus acris, Ranunculus flammula, Ranunculus abortivus. But what really makes them different from each other? How would you know that you've got one species and not the other? And that's really the fundamental question with identifying plants, being able to use plant identification to learn more about habitats. It's one of the most important things you can consider when you're trying to understand plants in nature. So some examples here of, I chose these images. These are plants that are closely related. They've got a lot in common. So they have features in common like having 5 petals. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 tiny petals in that one. The buttercups have an interesting feature where their petals, these white petal, yellow petals, are kind of reflective. They're shiny. So I got shiny yellow petals here, here, here. Lots of stamens, lots of separate carpels, 5 sepals behind. I haven't shown you any other parts of the plant, but even in the flowers, you can see there's a lot of similarity. But then to know that you've got one of these species and not the others, you'd be highlighting the differences between these species. So we have a plant with broad petals. We got a plant with sort of linear, slender petals, and then a plant with these tiny triangular petals that are smaller than the sepals, in fact. So when you're identifying a plant, are those important? Is that a feature you'd be able to use reliably to know these species apart from each other? So when we talk about species, a big part of what we're talking about, and certainly at an entry level, we're talking about being able to tell them apart, right? So one species is definitely different from another species. That means accounting for some variation and having a certain degree of confidence in your identification. But another way to look at species is species that are biologically different. So species, another way to look at this on a kind of a higher scientific level, is that these species are different. So we have lots of individuals of Ranunculus flammula, and they're going to have a lot of features in common. So whether you find it in one county or another, different times of year, they're still the same species. And they might grow not too far away from this other species. So what keeps them from being, say, the same? What is different about them over time? So another way to look at that, here's another example from plants in the carnation family. And these are in the same genus now, Stellaria, again with 5 petals, kind of an interesting version of 5 petals. Each of these petals is split into 2. So it's technically 5 petals, but it kind of looks like 10. Similar flowers, but different, maybe in a way that matters. How would you know, right? Is one bigger than another? I haven't got a scale on here. Is there something important about how they're different? You know, just looking at these, our eyes are pretty good at telling differences. There's a little difference in the pollen color on Stellaria longifolia versus Stellaria borealis. Is that important? How do we know? A little bit difference in the sizes are about the same, looks like, but difference in the shape of the leaves. Is that important? number of flowers, position of flowers. This flower looks bigger than that flower. Other features can be important. So let's say we do have two good species and we can tell them apart cleanly and they're biologically different. We've got some other features such as where they grow. You might find one plant in a certain kind of habitat versus the other species. So this one is more widespread, Stellaria longifolia. This species is more restricted to the northern Great Lakes region. And then I also have, going up the side here, a difference in their classification of where they like to grow from a wetland standpoint. So this plant on the right is an obligate wetland plant, always would be found in wet soils. And this plant on the left is what we call facultative wetland, meaning that it could grow in wet soils, but it also can grow away from wet soils. That makes it facultative. So being able to tell them apart is kind of a useful thing from a human standpoint, but under the surface, these plants are different from each other in having different ways to grow. That's an important part. So different ecology. Just when we talk about ecology, this is going to kind of come back around to species. Sometimes you can reliably learn something about your ecology and your habitat based on identifying your species correctly. So some other features that might be different among species that are closely related. These are two plants in the same genus, Thalictrum, and one has showy white petals here, and one has hardly any petals at all, and much more emphasis on stamens here. This is a plant that is dioecious, so this is male flowers here with big stamens, lots of pollen production, and pretty different from the plant on the left, which has more of an insect pollinated kind of flower form. So showy petals attract insects, and this plant on the right is probably not doing as much to attract insects, and instead devoting resources to a lot of pollen production. So one of the main differences between species can be that they have different reproductive strategies, and that reflects on, say, evolution. So each species has evolved and been selected for its own strategies that work out for it, and also means that these two species are not likely to cross-pollinate each other. So having different animals or wind move the pollen between them might mean that they're not getting their pollen mixed up, means that they are genetically distinct. That's an important part of being biological species. And actually I have it on there as biological species. The basic definition, kind of the most basic definition for biological species, is that two species are not able to mate with each other. So they're prevented from mating with each other. And in plants, there's a little bit different consideration than in animals, right? So animals have behavior that might keep them from interacting with each other. They have a coloration system or a behavioral mating dance or something like that. And plants maybe don't have that, where they're going to be interpreting other individuals, but they have this intermediary where they're involving animals in moving their pollen. And so the behavior of the animals ends up kind of standing in for the behavior of the plants. So here's an example of two species of penstemon with similar flowers, but much different sizes. So these flowers at different sizes, if they're attracting animals that need to crawl inside the flower to get some nectar, to do pollination, then we might actually have two species with similar flowers that are not able, even if they're growing next to each other, really not able to mix their pollen up between them. We've got one kind of bee visiting the species on the left and a different kind of bee visiting the species on the right. And I kind of skipped over it here, but this is the illustration again of two penstemon species with much different flower sizes. So big flowers, small flowers. One of the reasons to have bigger flowers might be to attract and accommodate larger pollinators. And if one species uses different pollinators than another species, then that can keep them from crossing with each other. So that keeps them genetically distinct, keeps them allowing to reinforce their certain morphological characters that make them one species or the other. Another consideration I alluded to earlier is that in telling these species apart, we want to highlight the features. So let's say you have a book and you're trying to identify a species. Your book is going to identify the features that are most distinctive most useful for telling species apart. So they might have a lot of features in common, but it'll be the features that are different and consistently different between them that are good for telling them apart. So being consistently different, that has to account for variation. So this slide highlights a little bit of natural variation. When you measure something in biology, if you're measuring the length of an organ, for example, the size, this is the stem diameter. If you measure this, you're going to get kind of a bell curve, a normal distribution of an average diameter and some extremes on the large side, some extremes on the small side. And you have to account for all those. So if you're using this trait, stem diameter, to tell one species from another, then the species in brown here, Nymphoides aquatica, has a minimum of like 0.5 millimeter down here. So everybody, if you wanted to account for every individual, they would be bigger than 0.5 millimeter. But that 0.5 millimeter, that area overlaps a lot with this related species, Nymphoides cordata. So you wouldn't necessarily be able to say that all members of Nymphoides aquatica are always different from all members of Nymphoides cordata with respect to this measurement. But you can explore things like this. This is I'm kind of highlighting an example where it is kind of difficult to tell these species apart. And this was an exercise looking for features that could be useful for telling these species apart. So we have kind of a generally larger plant, Nymphoides aquatica, generally smaller Nymphoides cordata, but lots of overlap between them. And so it might be a combination of these characteristics. So lamina, the leaf blade length, combined with stem diameter, combined with adventitious root diameter, all those together might be what it takes to tell these species apart. Another way to look at that, this is a graph called a principal components analysis, where individual sets of measurements are combined together to give you kind of a two-dimensional plot of diversity. So these areas tell you, or sorry, the arrows tell you which parts of the measurements, which measurements are useful for making these distinctions. We've got a leaf feature here, leaf length, leaf width, length to width ratio. That ends up being one of the more important features for telling these apart. But also on here, calyx length, petiole length, and that feature stem diameter might be a little useful for telling those apart. But it kind of highlights that we've got a cloud of definitely blue Nymphoides cordata and a cloud of definitely brownish Nymphoides aquatica. So they are distinct. They could be identified as separate from each other with a little bit of uncertainty. There's a whole bunch of this black X in here that's uncertain individuals. So sometimes it's even up to the experts, sometimes it can be difficult to tell one species from another. Maybe that's the take home from this slide here. Other features of variation sometimes are a little more extreme. So you might have a plant that has different kinds of leaves over the course of its lifetime. So we have, for example, mulberry. The juvenile or shaded forms of mulberry have deep lobes in their leaves. And the mature forms get a little bit less lobing, sometimes kind of irregular off to one side, but not the other. And then sometimes in our mulberry, we get a leaf like this, which doesn't have any lobes on it at all. So if you were using lobes as your identifying feature for this plant, you might encounter a mulberry tree that doesn't have that feature. So you'd have to kind of account for that as you're learning how to identify them. They might have a feature that's useful when it's present, but not always present. Here's another example. We've got a plant that's got different leaves depending on where it's growing. This plant has floating leaves that have entire blades, and it has underwater leaves, these submersed leaves, that are dissected. They're brought down so that you can basically only see the veins on there. So same plant species growing in different places can produce different leaves. So that also can be important to know. If you were looking for one type or the other of leaf, you might not always see the same kind of leaf in this species. So the title on here, intraspecific variation, is variation within the same species. So still good species, but not always exactly the same. So we'll kind of come back around to, it can be difficult to tell species apart. So I think we often maybe have this expectation that the plant we find is going to be exactly like the image. And I've got a good number of students, and I think introductory students often, they do picture matching, right? So you pull out the guide and you say, which picture does my plant look most like? And that's a mostly, most of the time that might get you to the right identification, but it's something you want to watch out for, and something that I emphasize that you don't want to do as a habit. So if you want to really get to the point where you're identifying plant species correctly, you want to not do the pattern matching, because we have, here we have two related species and they look pretty similar, and you might say, oh, this one's more skinny and this one's more stout. But you're kind of neglecting, in noticing that you have an image, just one image for each species, is neglecting all kinds of variation that you can't see on here. So you want to rely on an expert, like the author of your guidebook, to tell you what to look for. So just kind of keep that in mind, that just matching pictures, not a good way to first identify a plant that you don't know. Over time, you might get familiar with identifying them in that way, but not a good approach to unfamiliar species. But a good approach is to use a dichotomous key. So the basically every plant identification book, they usually have these dichotomous keys. The Wildflowers of Wisconsin book has a key that's not broken down in this way, and it's not quite the same kind of key, but the Wisconsin Flora book does have this kind of key. And this is very standard. You can find it in all sorts of botanical textbooks. So this is something you would use more in like a professional biology, botany context. And it would typically not be a book that's focused on, say, wildflowers or something like that. So a nice comprehensive guide like your Wisconsin Flora guide would have a key like this. The key that I've got on the screen now, this is one from the Flora of North America, which is a nice comprehensive guide to all the plants that grow north of Mexico in North America, including Wisconsin, of course. So good resource. If you did want to use that resource, you're facing probably a lot more, or definitely a lot more names than are just found in Wisconsin. So a good key to use would be the one that's devoted strictly to Wisconsin. So that's our textbook for this course. And we'll get a lot of practice out in the field using a dichotomous key. So I just have this up here as an illustration for now. Dichotomous key, the dichotomous part means, the di part of that means that every set of choices, there's two possible answers, and you get to choose between the two answers. So in this example, these are numbered. This number 5, this is called a couplet. So two of these together, two statements together, one of them should apply to the plant that you have, and one should not apply to the plant that you have. So this is a key to the genus of cottonwoods and poplars and aspens called Populus. And if you're in that genus and you got to this point, you would be trying to narrow your species down to one of these species. And at the end of this, if the first statement applies, then you would identify your plant as Populus heterophylla. If the second statement applies, this says go to the next number indicated here. So this says go to 6. And I just want to kind of point out what the good features are of a well-written key, is that it's got contrasting characters. So floral bracts, pubescent versus glabrous, anthers, apiculate versus truncate. You might want to use a glossary to look that one up. Number of flowers in the catkin, 10 to 15. This to 45, this is an extreme measurement. So usually 10 to 15, sometimes up to 45 flowers. And then this other choice, 15 to 150, sometimes as few as 3 or as many as 175. Discs are toothed, discs are entire. Winter buds, slightly resinous, resinous throughout. So some good, useful, many characters to choose from. And like I said, if you had a plant in hand and you were trying to identify it, you should be able to say that the statements for one of these choices all apply to your plant. Or maybe you don't have catkins and you'd have to use what you have available to you. And the statements for the other choice would not apply. So you should be choosing, looking at both of these at the same time and saying yes to some and eliminating other possibilities. For example, pubescent versus glabrous. If you think your plant is glabrous, you want to maybe just see what the other alternative is and rule out that it's definitely not pubescent, right? So eventually, if you follow your dichotomous key, eventually you'll get to a species. Sometimes there's a key to families or a key to genera, but eventually you get to an endpoint, which is the identification that you're looking for. So using a dichotomous key, as I say, is process of elimination. I mentioned the couplets, and then each part of the couplet is called a lead. And this is something that takes some practice using these. And as you go, you'll get better at it. Now, as far as identifying a species, another feature of your Wisconsin Flora book is that it's going to end up giving you an identification. And that's pretty standard in that kind of book to get to a species name. And the species names are scientific names. So these are official scientific names for species. And there's probably more here than you're maybe familiar with seeing in a species name. So we've got a portion here that's in italics, made up of two words, Coscuta coralii, Hypericum majus, Scutellaria ovata, Gallium brevipes, Iliocaris equisetoides, Antenaria plantaginifolia. Sometimes they're a mouthful, but the important part here is that they are agreed upon. So this is a name that people use around the world, and they're regulated. So part of being regulated is that the first word here is actually the genus name, and that becomes a category for the species. So two words make up a species name. And then after the italics are some abbreviations for people's names. So this is, it's kind of a holdover from how things were done previously. It's useful sometimes. For the most part, you can kind of ignore those names. These are the names of the people who came up with the plant names. So someone called Gray, that's his last name. He came up with a name originally that was then put into a different category. So Gray is in parentheses, Brit is not in parentheses. This means that Brit took the name that Gray had and put it into a different category, now in the genus Hypericum. All right, so if we break these down, I've got them in columns based on which part of the name they are. So the genus name is capitalized and comes first, and it's part of the species name. So technically this two-word block here, this is called a binomial or a species name. And in botany, we need both of these to identify something well. So there's a lot of plant species out there. You want to make sure that as you're communicating these, when you identify a plant, you spell out the genus name, spell out the specific epithet, and include that two-name binomial as your identification. These other parts, as I mentioned, if there's a name in parentheses, there's not always a name in parentheses, but if there is a name in parentheses, that means that there was a different name combination before that then got reclassified. So whoever made the current version is this name that's not in parentheses. And these are abbreviations for people. These are their last names. So individual people or pairs or sets of people. And there's a resource. You could look these names up if you wanted to. Even Wikipedia is pretty good at telling you what the abbreviations stand for. But again, you typically don't use these in common conversation, but if you identify a plant and you make a plant specimen, or if you run into a plant name in a scientific publication, they often have these going along with the names, and those are meant to remove ambiguity. So if we're uncertain about which use of this name to go with, these are the names of the people who established that use. Whew. Okay, so I mentioned, I alluded a little bit to these. The genus name is a category of classification. So as we've talked a few times already, the species has that binomial 2-word name, and the species name includes the genus name. So as we saw before, the capitalized name is the genus name, and that's a category. So maybe going back a little bit, if you had a plant in the genus Coscuta, this is one species, Coscuta corlei, and there'd be another species also in Coscuta, Hypericum, St. John's wort Hypericum majus. There'd be another species potentially of Hypericum, Scutularia ovata, and so on. So there's actually a category you could find all the species of Gallium that are in Wisconsin. There'd be several of those, and they'd all belong to the genus Gallium. And then genus, the plural of genus is genera, and genera belong to families. And as I have on here, being able to identify a plant family, this is something that's a good skill to have, just being able to identify some families, including this one that's highlighted on here. This is one of our more distinctive families called Asteraceae. And this is identified in part by having these what look like flowers actually made up of lots of tinier flowers. So if you got into this sunflower head, you would notice that these are all little individual flowers there. This is a head made up of individual flowers. This is a head made up of individual flowers. That's one of the traits of Asteraceae. So sometimes you can identify a family and get yourself a long way toward identifying the species if you know where to start as far as family. So we'll get some practice at that. If you're interested in taking a plant taxonomy course, that would be something that might emphasize a little bit more how to identify these individual families. But these are names also that you might want to get familiar with as you go through the course. So learning species, learning genera, learning families, that's all pretty useful. And basically above the level of family, we don't cover that too much. That's not emphasized so much unless you're a professional taxonomist. It's usually enough just to know your plant families from each other. So we'll do a lot of that as we get out in the field in this course, and you'll get some chance to apply these beautiful scientific names.